Okay, I think everybody is here now. So thank you all for coming and good evening to everyone. And thank you very much for attending the event. We're here tonight with Tamara and Matteo from the Cambridge Centre for Risk Studies, part of the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And so Tamara is the lead for business intelligence at the Centre, where her role includes developing real-time business intelligence analysis on emerging global risks, building a reference database for more than 1,000 years of historical catastrophes, and also working on scenario design and narrative development. Tamara also manages the Centre's research relationship with Pool Re, which provides terrorism insurance to insurers, and manages all research on cyber terrorism at the Centre. And Tamara is also in charge of the Cambridge Global Risk Index team. Matteo is a geopolitical risk researcher at the Centre, previously of Oxford Analytica, where he was a political risk analyst, and IHS Markit, where he was an energy analyst. Matteo specializes in the analysis of geopolitical trends and systemic risks to identify the strategic implications for major corporations and insurance firms. Matteo's research covers such topics as cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, the geopolitics of peak oil and the energy transition, and the impact of systemic risks on business and society. And so thank you very much to you both for speaking to us tonight, and I'll hand over to Tamara, who has some slides for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch, and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. It's really great to be here with you tonight. I have been a member of the Centre for Risk Studies for about 6 years now. Although my title is Lead for Business Intelligence, I was, until about a year ago, the lead for geopolitical research at the Centre, and covered all of our research under that kind of paradigm. Matteo joined us a couple of months ago, and so he's much more aware of like the sort of day-to-day challenges about how to apply his own political and geopolitical interests to our sort of work. So I thought that I would give us a little bit of context, give you a bit of a presentation about what the Centre is, what we do, what our accomplishments are, and then we can have some Q&A about how both of us use our skills, both use our interests in politics and geopolitics, and the developments in those technological areas as well, and just have a bit of a discussion about how we use those skills to apply to a business context. So yes, my computer can cooperate. So the Centre for Risk Studies, we're a research centre included in the University of Cambridge's Judge Business School. We're a multidisciplinary centre for excellence. So our research is largely sponsored. It's not necessarily academic in nature, but we collaborate with a number of insurers and large corporates and other business bodies who are interested in understanding the scope of risk, both geopolitical as well as sort of environmental, governance, technological, as it poses a risk to global business and the flow of international commerce and the global economy altogether. Our general sort of approach to understanding risk as a concept and understanding how it can impact all of these different areas is that we specialize in scenario development, and this is where a real sort of academic rigor is actually very useful. So we look at the context for a risk, we look at its history. Mitch mentioned that I'm sort of in charge of building an evidence basis for, we call it 1,000 years of history, but that's because we think about things like war and disease, which obviously have very, very long histories involved. But we also look at things like cyber risk, which have, maybe a decades level amount of case studies available to us. We also consult with experts in the field, and the fact that we're part of the University of Cambridge means that we're part of that research network, and we tap into that research network often in consulting with experts in the field. We build timelines and footprints for plausible but unlikely scenarios, so things like wars that may occur, terrorist attacks that may occur, market crashes that may occur, and we sort of build a little story about them. And then based on that story, we do a loss assessment. We may turn it over to our modelers for a quantitative assessment of how it may impact a business or an insurance line or something like that. Or we may just keep it a qualitative assessment. So we think about sort of direct and indirect impact, how this affects society, how it affects, investment in an area, things of this nature. And then we may add macroeconomic consequences and investment portfolio impacts on top of that, depending on the research partner that we're working with. So over the process of building out these scenarios, we found that we had so many that it was time to really start organizing them into a taxonomy. And so I think about 2 years ago, we finalized this taxonomy of business risks, which has these 6 main headings. So we have our financial risks, our geopolitical risks, technology risks, and then ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And each of these has sort of a group of family headings underneath it, and each of these has an actual sort of group of risks underneath each family heading. And so most of our research involves, a client or a research partner being interested in a particular family or a particular risk area, and then us sort of zooming in particularly on a couple of risks in that area, building out these scenarios, understanding how they connect with each other, and what their impacts may be if they do occur in future. And this sort of all kind of culminates in a number of different ways, but one of those ways is the Cambridge Global Risk Index, which we last published at the end of 2019 for the year ahead. I think one thing that I really want to pull out here is that we consider, a broad range of risks, both man-made and natural, but we have found that man-made risks, so market crash and interstate conflict in particular, have always had the highest risk when it comes to potential threat to the global economy. And so that really means to us that there can be decisions that are made and steps taken by major businesses and major institutions to actually ameliorate risk to the global economy. These are man-made risks, and so the solutions are also man-made. And we've always had human pandemic up in the top 5, and so we keep coming back to this again and again in our conversations with corporates in particular this year, that global pandemic has always been a really highly rated risk based on our research, and so that's sort of where we've been focusing for the last year, unsurprisingly. So we can build these scenarios, and that's a very creative process, but what do we actually expect businesses to do with it? We find that actually developing a scenario based on precedents, that it's believable, that it's understandable, that its effects are logical, actually allows C-suite members and risk managers to actually talk about a risk in terms of actual tangible sort of impact, which means that they can plan better, that they can make judgment calls without so much bias if they're actually talking about a concrete scenario. And they can actually also use it as a stress test to stress their own business plans, to stress their own security protocols, things like that. So it allows them to create a more rigorous strategic plan, and also sort of determine what their risk appetites are in terms of making investments or taking on debt, that sort of thing. And so what we tend to do for each of these scenarios is we might create a report, or what we're doing more and more now is we're creating a repository online of these sort of one-page scenario descriptions that businesses can then use in discussion internally if they're having risk discussions, or even if they're just having sort of, personnel discussions or something like that. And what we encourage with our business partners is that, we make this an iterative process. So sort of working on a scenario that has to do with terrorism, for example, is not a static thing. We might create a single scenario, but within 5 years, the nature of terrorism may change. And so that needs to be reviewed. So we always are going through a process with our partners to identify risks, to specify the threats and the sort of business protocols that they feel are most at risk and most concerned about, their behavior in a catastrophe situation, then evaluating and sort of prioritizing the scenarios and the appetite taken. Then figuring out how to mitigate those scenarios internally, which is usually on the research partner side, and then the monitoring, which is obviously the key part. And that's something that Matteo and I work on quite a lot, is the monitoring, particularly of geopolitical threats, which are so slow to move until they don't, until they're not slow. And then obviously everyone wants a lot of questions answered as soon as something big happens. So we're often trying to sort of make sure that we're constantly aware of what's going on in the world, so we can answer questions when they arise. Here's a small sampling of the geopolitical and politics research reports that we've produced at the Centre. So one of these is our very first report was back in 2014, where we hypothesized the economic and social impacts of an extended conflict between China and Japan in the South China Sea. And we conducted substantial review of the political science and conflict studies behind that study in order to identify a category of conflict that was plausible for modern political conditions, but also severe enough to challenge assumptions about the status quo, particularly for businesses, obviously. Another scenario which we published in 2014 supposed a plausible sort of third iteration of global social unrest stoked by austerity measures and broad youth unemployment. So we sort of took inspiration from the Occupy movement and then the Arab Spring to create this sort of millennial uprising scenario. And then the following year, we were one of the first research bodies to propose a total economic estimation on the losses attributed to the Bataclan terrorist attacks in Paris, based on precedent studies into the impact on tourism, consumption and investment in previous acts of political violence. And then we've got our cyber terrorism work, which I'm going to come on to a bit later because it's sort of our pride and joy. But over the course of working on these scenarios and working on sort of these family of geopolitical risks, we've put together a sort of a taxonomy in and of itself of more than 120 bilateral conflict scenarios, which we're working on. So we've identified those through diplomatic protests, military skirmish, also historical context and historical conflicts, political posturing, consulting with experts regarding possible moves in policy, to sort of create that kind of library of conflicts that we can draw from when we design a scenario. So in addition to all that sort of hypothetical work, we're also building indicator trackers using a lot of natural language analyst software to try and sort of get an idea if there's any kind of way to create an early warning system for things like protest. So for example, this is tracking shot of social unrest in Hong Kong from 2 years ago. We also have another for looking at interstate conflict and geopolitical tension with Iran from 2015 through to 2019, and how that's escalating and what kind of conclusions can we draw from that. This is a little bit of a process that benefits from retroactive sort of analysis, but we're trying to draw enough conclusions from retroactive and historical analysis to be able to make some semi-confident assessments based on the, semi-confident assessments on the future. So you heard in our introductions from Mitch that both Matteo and I do quite a lot of work in the cyber domain. And this is obviously because cyber is applicable to kind of all areas of risk now. The kind of addition of technology and innovative technology in war and in terrorism is something that our research partners are really interested in and that we're very interested too. And back in 2016, we partnered with Pool Re, who are the mutual insurer for terrorism losses in the UK, a mutual insurance between government and the insurance industry. They've been in existence since 1993 and the Bishopsgate bombing that occurred then in London. And they're interested in basically the future of terrorism and what future losses may look like. So we sort of derived a means of understanding the plausible future of cyber terrorism. So terrorists using cyber to create physical damage. That's kind of the key point here, is that it's not necessarily about data losses or espionage, but this is whether terrorists can actually use cyber to remotely, erode systems and blow things up and make hospitals go offline. We've already seen that some of these things are plausible, but we wanted to see whether it was something that terrorists are interested in, whether it's something that terrorists are able to build a capability in, and then what would the actual impact of that be. Per our assessment, this is still an over-the-horizon threat, but it's something, again, that we're maintaining monitoring for on a bi-yearly basis. So we provide threat assessments to Pool Re twice a year, looking at how the cyber geopolitical domain changes over time, with new vulnerabilities being discovered, with new technologies coming into the fore, with new changes in the economic structure of the dark web, things like that. So these are all things that we kind of add into our assessment of this geopolitical threat going forward. And our research approach here is very simplistic, so I just thought I would provide this this diagram for it. So we consult with cyber specialists to kind of understand what's possible. and what's likely to happen. You can't necessarily make a laptop explode just by executing an explode function, but what can you do? And then obviously we have the loss modeling process, which is how much of this is insured, what will trigger an insurance claim, that sort of thing. But then the key kind of place where the political interests and political backgrounds come into the fore is understanding what is actually plausible to occur based on the motivations of political parties and political actors out there, particularly terrorists in this particular case. So what do terrorists want to do? What does this current generation of terrorists want to do? What might the next generation of terrorists want to do? And can they achieve those things using cyber? So part of the reason that we think that cyber terrorism is an over the horizon threat is that the extremist radical Islam sort of generation of terror that we're currently in is very focused on mass casualty events and on high spectacle events. And these aren't things that you can necessarily achieve by enacting ransomware attack on a hospital. I mean, you might do, but you would have a huge amount of chance that comes into that. It's much more effective to send, a person into a crowd with a knife, for example. So at the moment, we don't feel it's a pressing threat because that intersection of motivation and capability is not yet there. This has been a focus in the UK industry that we've been looking at, but we've actually exported this research and we've looked beyond the UK. We worked with the Australian government a couple of years ago, looking at the plausibility of cyber terror in the Asia Pacific. And obviously that was a completely different sort of approach because you're dealing with a lot of different actors. You're dealing with the geographical isolation of Australia in particular as a member of Five Eyes, who are the neighboring countries that might wish it harm. Australia is also very interesting in that it's one of the only countries with a explicit cyber retribution policy, which is public. So they are at high risk of getting into some sort of escalatory campaign of cyber attacks. So this is something that they were very concerned with, looking at what is at risk if they pursue retaliatory attacks for, something like a data breach from another country like Vietnam or something like that. And just to finish up, I wanted to mention sort of what we're looking at for the year ahead. So we're actually developing our geopolitical research quite a lot this year. We're trying to think in terms of plausible sort of future directions for the geopolitical landscape as a whole globally, and how we might focus in on scenarios that can tell us how, how actors may behave under a lot of different sort of ways of thinking about the geopolitical landscape. So what are the great powers that might come into rivalry? What are the terrorist entities that may grow out of the current economic climate? How might climate change put pressure on various geopolitical relationships? Things of this nature. So this is a very nascent piece of research that we're doing, but I just wanted to share with you a little bit of the kind of broader research that we're encountering this year. And so that's sort of my summary of how we go about our research. Thank you very much for your time, sorry. Please feel free to contact myself or Matteo if you have any further questions after this Q&A period. We're also hiring this year, so do get in touch if you're interested in the kind of work that we do and you'd like to be a part of it. In particular, there's geopolitical research that we're building out this year. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Tamara. That was fascinating, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed that. So I've just sent into the chat. I'm sure you're both able to see, asking for questions. But in the meantime, whilst the questions start coming in, I wondered if yourself and Matteo could perhaps just talk for a minute also on how you ended up at the Centre for Risk Studies, because I think political risk is a term that piques people's interest, but they're perhaps not aware of it as a career path, especially coming out of university. Perhaps they're more focused, I don't know, on management consultancy or traditional types of consultancy. So I'd be interested to know both how you both ended up in your current roles, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Tam, would you like to
Sure.
start? You have perhaps
I have
a longer
little bit of an
story.
unorthodox path to this career choice, but I'm actually a historian by education, and to be more specific, I'm actually a medieval historian by postgraduate education. And I got a job at the university as a copy editor. So I was working on a number of the centre's risk reports, just simply in a sort of editorial formatting context. But I was really, really interested in the work, and I began to actually help out with some of the research, because obviously, given my historical background, you have quite a rigorous education that it deals with, research. And I think essentially the executives at the centre felt that medievalism had quite a close sort of analogue with understanding, in particular, terrorist groups and sort of territorial disputes. And they're not wrong, it was just a little bit of a reach, but that was about 5 years ago now. And so I've sort of learned on the job since then. In particular, the cyber terrorism work has been a really welcome challenge, because there's not a lot of extant research or academia in the topic, and we really kind of built the frameworks and the rubrics for that sort of area of study wholesale ourselves. So that's really kind of how I came to be in this area. And I'm still basically learning, and I'm always very happy to talk with people who have far more of a academic rigorous training than I do. But I think that's part of the great thing actually about working at the centre, is the fact that we do draw from a multidisciplinary background. And so there's areas where you can really invest your time in something that maybe you just had as a hobby prior to joining.
Yeah, if I may add on this, I agree with you, Tam. Perhaps what really makes the center unique is its multidisciplinary nature. I am perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, Tam, I'm the only one with a background in political science and international relations.
I think so.
Exactly. So we look at risk really from every possible perspective. So we have economists, engineers, geographists, historians like Tamara, psychologists, exactly. So that's really the richness of the work we do. Whereas I have the most classical, perhaps, of the path in terms of political risk. I started with an internship at Oxford Analytica. It's a long-standing political risk consultancy. I was interning at the New York City office for a few months and continued collaborating freelance while graduating. And after that, I changed a little the industry. I went working for IHS Markit. That they do have a country risk department, but I was working as an oil markets analyst. That was interesting and useful to have a cross-industry perspective. And when the offer from the center came, I accepted right away. I was too nostalgic of the political risk sector, and the work they do it's really interesting. So the work we do is really interesting. So yeah, I would say there is no right background to be part of our team, at least. Perhaps it's more the skills that we are looking at, for sure.
Great, thank you both. So I have some questions, first of all, from Celsius. So I'll just unmute and hopefully.
Thank you, Mitch.
There we go.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I would like to ask, because your work is so future-facing, what sort of emerging skills would you say future political risk analysts need to keep up with this continuously developing geopolitical landscape?
Matteo, do you have a response?
Oh, okay, I can go also, because this thank you for your question. This is a very good question. It connects me to exactly how I ended the answer to the previous question. I would say in general, to work on political risk, what I learned is that the knowledge you acquire in the university, of course, is going to be useful. The understanding how the world works, how politics work, great power rivalry, but also regional focus, of course, help. What though the university perhaps prepare you for the best for a job in political risk is the ability to quickly analyze issues and try to take ownership on what you're looking at, and being able to advise someone on it, perhaps in a very short period of time. That's essential. We receive requests from clients that go well beyond our sphere of expertise. Just to make an example, me and Tamara have been working for a few months on just to keep it general, on a biological terrorism scenario. It's a very unlikely scenario, and none of us is a biologist, although we have to quickly catch up on that, and also none of us has a technical background, but you need to be able to understand what are the implications and what the basic understanding of a topic, and try to quickly make it yours in order to be able to give strategic direction towards to the client. So I would say the ability to understand and deliver something, and trying to understand what the client wants, what is their need. Sometimes they don't even know themselves, so you need sometimes to be better than them at understanding what are the risks that their business may incur. And then, of course, in the future, to answer your question, perhaps having a little bit of quantitative skills, of course, help. We always look for someone that is also able to quantify informations and perhaps model them in order to give a specific output of the research. So that's perhaps what I would say in the future is what would make a good political risk analyst.
I think there's a lot to be said for honing a skill for sort of summary. As a historian, I generally chafe against anything like a unchanging static definition of something. However, when it comes to communicating these complex ideas, you really need to be able to sort of propose frameworks and headings and broad themes and things like that, just as a starting point to kind of get people understanding the page that you're on. I've sort of just been thinking while Matteo was talking, and I think you need to be able to sort of paint with broad brushstrokes, even though you understand that nuance is kind of everything when it comes down to it. So I think that's something that's really going to shape the future of sort of consultancy in political risk in particular, is being able to kind of condense big ideas and big movements down to a series of like sort of bullet points of symptoms or something like that. It may be that in simplicity there is a risk of misunderstanding, but if you can get somebody to buy in with that simple sort of contextualizing, then you can work on the nuance, you can work on sort of the specificity of your recommendation or your insight or something like that. But you need to start with a small idea to get people to understand a big idea that you may have. And then the additional thing that I would say is that nothing in this world happens in a vacuum, and we all know that in terms of politics. Something may look random at the time, but in hindsight, it obviously had deep roots. And I would say that's the same for thinking about politics and thinking about geopolitics, is that you're better off consulting with others and networking and listening to other people's ideas than simply working with your own assumptions. I think we can have really strong beliefs about how things have happened before, and we think that things will just happen the same way again. But I think it's always important to keep an open perspective and to listen to others. This sounds a little crunchy, I'm sorry, but you know, I think just building a network, not being afraid of conversation, of collaboration, is something that is really important, especially if we look at sort of just the way that politics behaves these days. I think listening to each other is a key part of making sense of it going forward.
Great, thank you very much both. The next question I have is from Bryn, who I'm currently studying Russian studies here at Oxford with. So I'm just going to unmute Bryn, and hopefully that should work.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, guys. I just had one quick question. I was wondering about the nature of the clients that the center works with, and particularly over your time at the center, how have their interests changed? Are there any particular topics or geographical regions at the moment that are becoming increasingly popular, or clients becoming increasingly interested in, and so on?
Yes, I have a number of interesting anecdotes about that. I'll just sort of pick a couple of choice ones. But when I first joined the centre, we were working a lot with insurance bodies. And as time has gone on, we've been switching to work with more corporates. So we're looking at more at like sort of big business and flow of commerce and large retailers, and thinking about how they'll behave in the future, and how they consider their principal and emerging risks. So that's been some change in terms of our priority. But in terms of their priorities and how they've changed, I mean, one reason that I drew attention to the fact that we're sort of broadening our geopolitical research in the year ahead is actually because this is our first sort of dedicatedly broad geopolitical research project that we've had from a research partner, because I think traditionally corporates felt that wars in the Middle East didn't have a huge impact on their sales of clothing or something like that, even though we were sort of very keen for people to understand the risks that are inherent in globalism and in global supply chains for a long time. This is sort of something that they're slow to catch on to. And this is actually something that's generally true, is that industry is pretty slow to adapt to academia, I would say. You know, they like to think we're in our ivory towers and we're sort of shaking our fists at the stars. And then 5 years later, they're like, oh, the stars, they said something. One thing that's really interesting has been, when I first joined the center, we had just developed a cyber catastrophe scenario. And it was one of the first sort of major global cyber catastrophe stress tests that was designed for industry across the board. And it didn't have a lot of take up. We found that sort of within 2 years, people were very concerned about cyber. They were concerned about sort of data breach and about ransomware. But we were concerned in showing people that cyber could have a physical result in terms of damage, particularly for industrial and critical national infrastructure systems. And we did a scenario, a piece of research for Lloyd's in 2015, I believe, which is called the Business Blackout, which was essentially a cyber war scenario in which cyber actors, very sophisticated cyber actors, attacked the part of the US power grid and caused a very significant shutdown and rolling blackouts, and sort of what the impact that was for business. And it led to a huge amount of the rest of our cyber work, because I think a lot of the industry and a lot of companies hadn't actually realized that cyber could have this sort of major impact. And we did a subsequent scenario looking at the UK power grid, and we decided, rather than the US scenario had been focused on exploitation of transformers, but the UK one, we decided, let's change up, let's do something different, let's look at the substation vulnerability from, you know, sophisticated cyber actors. And I remember we were about a week from publication, and the research body we were working with said, look, this doesn't seem likely. You know, how likely is it that a nation state is interested in attacking the substation network of another country and just causing a blackout? And we said, well, we think it's reasonably possible. We looked at, consulted with all the experts, we looked at all the history. We think this is something that in a multipolar world, this is something that could happen. And then it went to publication. I was sitting with the client, and this was around Christmas time. And then when we got back in the new year, the Ukrainian substation attack had occurred, where it's highly suspected that Russian cyber actors caused rolling blackouts in the Ukraine by attacking substations. And the client came back to us and said, well, it's happened now, so we're not interested in the report. Basically, we're like, we've already said something that's already known to have happened. Therefore, this isn't cutting edge research anymore. That's the only time that's happened, but it does sort of stand out in our memories as a time when we really did feel like sort of Cassandras. And I think that kind of comes back to the fact that we went through a period where companies were incredibly interested in cyber and cyber geopolitical activity and risk. And that's now sort of subsiding again. I think maybe people think that we've gone through the year of ransomware, and maybe it's not such a big deal. It's an individual business concern rather than an industry-wide concern. And so now their focus is really looking at climate change, we find. So we maintain a really strong research interest in environmental climate change risk and in cyber risk. But I think post-Trump and given sort of Brexit and a lot of changes in the EU, this interest in geopolitics is starting to pick back up again. And I think this research project that we have this year is probably the first of many that are going to be interested in looking sort of at the mid to long term impact of a lot of geopolitical movement. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
But it was also like right answer. I mean, like as you said, Tam, the starting point from many industry actors, so to say, is that in the end, geopolitics doesn't have that much of an impact as other economic or financial forces may have on their business, and instead turns out it does, and especially now in an increasingly unpredictable world politics landscape, it's more and more important that business executives and boards are informed on what are the political and geopolitical risks that they may encounter in various regions of the world or just globally for their business operations. And so far, has like most of companies have dealt with geopolitical risk on a anecdotal basis. Usually, they have 1-2 in-house analysts informing them on the base, or maybe just reading the news or hearing from a friend or schoolmate now in the government, instead of actually relying on data. That's what we are trying to provide with the work we do on the geopolitical side. Of course, as Tam said, lots of the interest now is on climate change and cyber. Climate change as well is enlarging as well in its scope. It's not just climate change risks, so floods and droughts and natural phenomena. It's also all that comes together with the politics and economics of climate change. Therefore, the energy transition and what policies may some governments take to encounter their climate goals and therefore disrupt the business
Everyone's very concerned with a retroactive carbon tax. Can tell you
exactly. So that implies a lot of potential liquidity risk for companies having to comply with new policies, having to invest huge amounts of money all of a sudden on trying to offset their carbon footprints. So these risks matter a lot. So companies are trying to make sense of the world more and more, and they try to have the information as quantitative as possible. So if we can provide them with a model, we do. Otherwise, the way we found is to make a scenario, basically. So we try to tell them what could happen and tell them to act accordingly, or at least to keep that in mind and analyze other situations with the guidelines we give them with the scenario. Please.
Sorry.
If
you continue.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think if anyone in the audience is considering sort of career prospects and interest in this area, I think that there may be sort of a hiring surge soon, because frankly, I think a lot of businesses, and this is largely in the corporate sphere, have been concerned in terms of their risk based on the things they can control. So basically where they're sourcing their products from, who they're selling to, how they manage their ad campaigns, their litigation costs, that sort of thing. And they haven't been so much concerned with external factors and external risks. But COVID has really changed all of that. So the understanding that actually an event that occurs, well, that can occur to the nation, but can occur, across the world, might have a huge business impact for them, is something that you'd think that a lot of businesses would have sort of figure that one out, or that would be more or less common sense. But I think it's changing massively. Just in the last year, we've seen a lot more concern with actual external shock factors. And I think that's part of the reason why this geopolitical risk project has come our way, and why I think there'll be more that follow it, is because this the idea of the sort of existential or external factor that might impact a single business or an industry is kind of coming to the fore post-COVID.
Absolutely, and if I may add something to this, just to go back to the point very quickly, so we leave space to other questions concerning clients. Well, we, as Tamara said, we have usually corporate or insurance clients, and the work we do differs according to who's commissioning it. So more interestingly, for instance, for the insurers, we tend to look at very unlikely but potentially catastrophic risks, because are the ones that are the least covered by insurance policies, and which allows maybe it's weird, because you're studying something that you know yourself is probably not going to happen, and hopefully it is not going to happen for the scale that it entails, but you can really be creative about it. And when you make a scenario about solar wind storm, or about a biological terrorist attack, or a cyber terrorist attack, not very likely, but potentially disastrous. That's what the insurance wants to know. How can we include those tail events, so very low probability, high risk events in our policies? So depending on the clients, of course, changes the kind of work we do.
Great, thank you very much both. From Sam from London Politica. So Tamara, I know you mentioned some of the more quantitative work that you do and stuff involving software, and Sam would like your opinion on whether in the near or longer term future that there'll be an industry-wide shift towards forecasting or modeling using such things as AI, and whether that might reduce the need for human analysts and open source research, or whether you think it'll always be a combination of the both that offer kind of different benefits. That's
such a sort of important question. I think in terms of career prospects, we're all like, I hope not. I think that industry is very interested in automating a lot of its forecasting, a lot of its risk assessment. It's something that we're also trying to build in, but I think we're trying to build it in as like sort of an accessory to traditional research. And my general feeling is that may occur, but I think there is risk, for lack of a better term, that there is a huge risk entailed in that, because you'll lose the human intelligence aspect, and I don't think there's going to be much of a substitution for that in the medium or the long term. I know particularly in the UK there remains, particularly up in government, there remains a huge emphasis on human intelligence and human assessment, rather than AI or machine learning sort of spitting out sort of a number at the end in terms of, you know, what's the risk today. So I think that's less of an issue here. It may be a challenge going forward, but I suppose my general personal feeling is that I don't think it will really ever substitute sort of human consultancy, particularly on issues of man-made risk like war or other political factors.
Great.
I completely agree with you, Tam, and I would say there will be an inclusion it will accelerate the inclusion of AI into the work we do, into the industry, consulting on every level, not just political risk, but it will always be a help, basically a support for human analysts, rather than there are things that simply you can't predict with an algorithm. Even when you look at systemic risks, for instance, it's useful to have models in place that allow you to understand what are the chain reactions of specific events, even made-man ones. But AI can't quite still factor in the human component within the risk, how humans react for instance, to both natural or human risks. So it's a dynamic process as well, trying to understand and communicate your risk and try to find the strategic response to those. So AI can't do that yet, but it certainly comes in handy to collect data, for instance.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both. And in the interest of time, I'll kind of merge these two questions together. So, Tamara, I know you mentioned in your earlier presentation how a chain of events can come seemingly randomly, or things spiral out of control, for example, with the Arab Spring or other similar examples. So, Kenneth has asked, how does the Centre prioritize its research agenda or objectives for 2021? Is that client-led, or do you have internal discussions on that? And then similarly, Sergio picked up in one of the slides that you mentioned a potential political crisis in France and potentially a move towards France considering or potentially even leaving the EU. So how, once you've decided upon those research agendas or objectives, how do you then categorize these events according to, how possible is it that France leaves the EU, or how possible is it that something more serious erupts with Russia again, for example, which I know was mentioned in one of your earlier slides. So if you could kind of take those two together, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I would say that largely our research objectives are client-led, unfortunately. I think ideally we would have a little bit more academic structure in terms of just exploring our own interests. And that's something that I think we're trying to build into the future of the Centre, is basically building enough of a buffer from that corporate sponsorship to also have interest in sort of an academic proximity to risk and taking on more PhD students, for example. So yeah, the short answer to that is that it's largely client-led. When it comes to sort of prioritizing, well, likelihood is always a difficult question to answer, and you have to base it largely on, I mean, we're trying to build a historical database simply so that we can have a little bit more evidence behind likelihood that we assign to events. But you do have to base a lot of it on like sort of consultation with experts and that sort of thing, and sort of licking your finger and putting it in the wind and seeing what happens. This is something we struggle with quite a lot with cyber, for example, because there's not a long history of events to kind of make a comparison point with. And we also haven't seen the worst of cyber events, basically. Yeah, so likelihood is always a challenge, and it's one that I think we're still sort of embarking on figuring out how we deal with it. But in terms of prioritizing our approach, a lot of that again comes from consultation with clients and experts. So, I mean, for example, that sort of list of kind of plausible scenarios that we're thinking of looking at this week, we've already gotten some feedback from that saying there's a massive hole in that, you know, trade war between the US and China is one of the most major sort of lenses, geopolitical lenses that, you know, the world has today, and it would be a disservice to understanding the geopolitical landscape without looking at that. So we're going to include that in that research sort of packet. When it comes to looking at something like sort of France's exit to the European Union, that's obviously something that we don't think is highly likely. But that particular sort of research purview, we're looking at sort of mid and long-term events and how we can sort of choose a single event, a single hypothetical event to demonstrate, you know, likely geopolitical responses or likely geopolitical effects, as well as, you know, the least likely geopolitical effects. So we're trying to pick something that's sort of intense enough that there's a big area for discussion around it. And so it's a little bit of a balancing act, sort of trying to figure out the thing that feels realistic, that feels, you know, because if it's not realistic, then people stop talking about it. So I think, for example, we weren't like, let's do nuclear war between Peru and Kazakhstan. Like, no one's gonna you know, entertain any kind of discussion around even the plausible effects of something like that. But you know, the concern, I think, under that French exit, I realize that's a euphemism, but that French exit sort of scenario is looking at the impact of democratic backsliding. And that's a concern largely in the US and in Europe. So we were like, let's pick a big enough European country where that would make a really significant difference, even though the risk is most inherent in places like Poland or Belarus or Hungary. How much is a UK industry body really going to worry too much about Hungary? They're going to worry about France. So let's like take the action and sort of put it slightly more center stage, which in itself is a bit of a concern because we're trying not to be too Eurocentric in our research. And that's sort of something that I think on that same slide, we had a column regarding different areas of the world that were concerning with different areas of research. But sort of sometimes that's kind of the exercise you have to perform in order to sort of get the result, the discussive research result at the end.
Perfect. Thank you, Tamara. So we've just got, I know we've only got a few minutes left, so I'll fire a couple of questions if that's okay. So, I mean, I don't know if either of you have read Political Risk by Condoleezza Rice and Amy Zegart from Stanford, and obviously Bush's former Secretary of State. Now, they develop a really simple matrix on risk management strategies, like a 2x2 box, and it's very simplistic. But Darren, who is interested in digital health and investment, wonders how, first of all, you go about starting to develop a very simplistic risk management strategy. Like, what are the building blocks for a company that you're advising or a client that you're advising? And then secondly, how do you kind of stress test those strategies that you've come up with? Do you go through like war game kind of things to stress test your methodologies? So yeah, if you could take that, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll sort of try and cover that quickly, I guess. Well, stress testing sort of became a big thing in the insurance industry and in the financial industry following 2008, because basically it was that no one had done any stress testing. And so when there was stress, everyone failed. And everyone failed the stress test routinely for a number of years after that, the major banks and that sort of thing. So, stress testing really got its kind of heyday sort of 2010 around, which is when the center started. So it's sort of how we kind of came up with our bread and butter for the stress test scenario. When it comes to sort of setting a risk appetite, I suppose when we're working with corporates, they generally have a risk matrix of their own, which is sort of like likelihood versus impact. And they essentially determine, what's the maximum that they're willing to lose in a certain circumstance, and that everything that falls above that line is something that they have to mitigate. So it's either something they have to purchase insurance for, it's something they have to diversify investments for, it's something that they have to train staff for, or something like that. And so that sort of informs their own internal policy. And everything below that line is something that they think that they can basically deal with. And that's kind of how we're sort of building out those risk expectations now, especially with our corporate clients. As for sort of the rigor of the stress test exercises, I mean, a lot of the time, if we're building those for insurance, we're essentially trying to bankrupt the insurance body to demonstrate to them that this is something that they, we're not actually, but like in the model, to demonstrate this is something that, they actually have to sell more product for, or something that they really have to make sure that their own customers mitigate against. And I suppose that's really kind of the point, is we're trying to build sort of healthier risk management habits in industry. And, that's something that obviously comes into play a lot when you're talking about cyber risk, is sort of propagating better cyber hygiene, for example, and builds better awareness about how external factors can impact, someone's pension and livelihood. I suppose that's not a very broad answer to that question, but I suppose the short answer is that it differs in every case, and it's really up to the client to determine whether or not the stress test is rigorous enough for the reasons they've requested it. But that's how we kind of do it ourselves. And then in terms of actually building them internally, a lot of the time it's Matteo and I go into a room and decide where we're going to drop a bomb, and where if we were comic book villains, where would we do something dastardly, and then we try not to get overheard by other people in other offices.
Always clean your search history after your work day. Yeah.
And if we could, it's 6 o'clock, so if I could just ask you both one quick question. If you could pick one issue and one region to watch in 2021, and for you, Matteo, it can't be oil or the energy transition, and for Tamara, it can't be anything to do with cyber, what region and issue would you pick to keep an eye on in 2021?
Maybe I can try to answer that. I would say, well, there's one issue that is not necessarily going to be just like limited to a region. It's a global phenomenon. We are keen on understanding, as Tam also mentioned, how the strategic rivalry between China and the US is going to unfold in the next few years ahead. For instance, there will be three main categories under which this will unfold. Probably we know COVID-19 and the long tail of COVID-19, so vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism. We know for sure that by now the US has an advantage, but we don't know how long that may last, with China having developed recently a new vaccine itself, may catch up soon and gain the upper hand by, for instance, just delivering more vaccine to the global south, and so using the COVID-19 pandemic to expand its influence in half of the world, especially if coupled with a continued Belt and Road expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative, also leaning on the fact that more states will be cash-strapped and impoverished by the pandemic. So COVID-19 for sure will feed this competition, as well as the energy transition. You asked me not to mention it, I'm mentioning it, but with China being on the edge of the green technology evolution, and perhaps even the multilateralization of the rivalry with the US, trying to include also the traditional allies, so Japan, the EU, India, in countering China on the main controversial policies, which may lead in turn to trade disruption between these countries and China. So the global rivalry may have repercussion regionally. So I would say I would pick this one to keep an eye on. I don't know if you, Tam, have something else in mind.
Yeah, I think mine is also COVID-19 influenced naturally. There have been a huge amount of autocratic policies that have been pushed through in parts of the Middle East and Africa, sort of barring of free press, limiting the distribution of newspapers under social hygiene concerns, limiting, the number of people who are allowed to gather in one place. This is all shoring up a lot of autocratic regimes, and I think that's going to have an impact sort of 10, 20 years down the line. There may be an additional sort of Arab Spring, probably 5.0 by that point, but I think that's something really to look at. And the other thing I'm very interested in is how Russia behaves post-COVID. We don't really know the impact that the disease has had there, because the information is so scatty and so unreliable coming out of Russia. But will it inflame Russia's territorial aggressions? Will they seek to make a bold posturing attempt in Eastern Europe again, or will they have to take on more influence from Beijing? Will we see Beijing encroaching on the EU in terms of soft power? Those are two things I'm very interested in, and that's what I think we're going to be looking at over the next decade.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Matteo, and thank you, Tamara, and some big questions to take away, I guess. So thank you very much both for your time and for everyone who attended. And I'm sure, I know, Tamara, you put your email and contact information on your last slide. So I'm sure you'll perhaps have some follow-up questions due to the shortage of time. So thank you very much both once again, and thank you to everyone for attending this evening. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.